Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome to episode number 30 of STR Intel Podcast with your host, Killian Gordon from Hosty. Today we have Ela Mezhiborsky joining us, co-founder and CPO at Autohost. Autohost is an intelligent guest screening assistant for vacation and short-term rental operators. That was a very, very brief summary of really what Autohost is and the capabilities, so I'm going to let Ela just take it from here and give us a brief summary of what Autohost is so we can dive in. We got a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, hi Killian. Thank you so much for having me. This is exciting. And the name was great.
Thank you.
So you pronounced it right. And that was a good intro. That really is what Autohost does. So we're an identity verification and fraud prevention platform, and we're primarily focused on the hospitality space. So we work with professional operators and basically help mitigate the risk that is related to hosting guests, be it from the vetting purpose to automation of processes, kind of for safety reasons, for compliance reasons. Down the line, they can definitely affect, protecting your revenue, increasing future revenue. So that's really where we fit into the puzzle.
Absolutely. And of course, so Hosty uses Autohost as a way to screen our guests as well. And we began looking for a solution to take screening guests to the next level. One of the first questions out of most owners, especially first-time short-term rental owners and people who have been doing it for a little bit, is how do you screen the guests? What do you look for? And they're always very excited to share with us how they've been screening their guests for several years. And we just found that maybe relying just on what the guest is saying and relying on the subjective peer review system wasn't quite dialing into screening guests and then also fraud like we wanted. So would you mind touching on, maybe in a nutshell, guest screening is just risk mitigation like you had mentioned. So how is Autohost taking guest screening from kind of the subjective, hey, this is what the guest is saying they're doing, these are their 3 or 5 reviews that they have. How is Autohost taking that a little bit above and beyond?
Right. So there's a few tiers to guest screening. And so I'll say that no matter at what level you're at, going up a level is always great. So if you're not doing anything, then ask some questions, see what the guests are saying, right? And you're right, if you're asking some questions, then move on to the next level and see if you can collect some more information, personal information, security deposits to have the guests be reliable for those things. And that's kind of how Autohost got started. We actually started not by implementing the actual process, which we do now. We started with just giving suggestions. So we started with saying, hey, given your reservation parameters and given all the risk, we're going to run our magic, run our algorithm, take all the data points into consideration, and basically say, we would spit out a bunch of things that you should do. Like in this case, this seems quite safe. Just make sure to reiterate the basic rules and, that they can be on their way. In this case, we see some red flags. Make sure to collect ID, give them the stricter set of rules, and maybe even arrange an in-person check-in, things like that. So we would start with a list of recommendations. But then what Autohost does now, so say when we talk about full platform, is that we're the ones that are able to now automate these things for our clients. So when you use Autohost, beyond asking questions, which is still very important. So right there on Autohost, you can have things like, what is the purpose of your stay? And do you agree to those rules? And who's coming with you? These are not all techie checks, but they're all very valuable because a legitimate guest that is not up to no good is going to be willing to provide that information. They recognize the responsibility in renting out a property. They have nothing to hide, and therefore your responsibility is just to take that info, store it safely, making sure you're not compromising their personal information, but basically make sure that the entire transaction is not a black box. So things you can do a level above just asking certain questions is really some objective data points include ID verification. So we keep ID on file, but we also actually verify the validity of the ID. We do biometric scans, so people will be taking a selfie, comparing themselves to the ID, because that's also an element where it's very easy when needed to kind of find a loophole in the system, say even with an Airbnb profile, to use an existing profile or pay somebody off for a profile when it comes to, unfortunately, we see some local gang activity that would do that, pay off a teenager or a 19-year-old to open an account. So Biometric scans are important. You have things like credit card on file, security deposit. When needed, you can run background checks and credit checks. We do things like scanning the actual IP and system. So under the most bottom kind of core layer of what Autohost does is also threat intelligence software. So we also go deeper towards, are they using a burner phone number? Is there any risk? Now we're getting into serious fraud, but is there any risk of false
Yeah.
identity? Is the person, and a false identity could be a simple, they made a mess, they got too many bad reviews, so they're opening a new Airbnb profile and trying to pretend to be John Doe. Or it could be more serious fraud that then results in criminal enforcement activity. You're getting into, I mean, identity theft and sex trafficking and drug smuggling and weapons and so on. So all of these elements are important to kind of bring into the
Well,
picture.
so there's absolutely a lot there. I've got a few questions off of that. Going back to almost one of the very first things you said, and the origins of AutoHost was you guys just started really as a recommendations. Hey, this is how you should handle this or whatnot, and you still hold true to that. Once a guest is screened, you give a set of recommendations based on the information that you sift through, and
That's true. It's legacy. So what you see there is really just that. That's the point. That is the legacy platform, and we made a decision not to move it away because it's also very valuable
yes, because
input.
speaking to owners sometimes, people investigating trying short-term rentals for the first time or who have been doing it, they may, we might be very excited to tell them that we're screening guests off platform. We're using essentially AI to screen guests off platform. But the next follow-up question sometimes is, well, is a human manually reviewing it? I manually review all my reservations, etc. And so it's one thing just to leave the reservation up to, I guess, artificial intelligence screening, but it's very important to also have a human. So for Hosty, it's our guest communication staff is also reviewing that reservation and looking at those recommendations. And like you had pointed out, you'll see everything from suspicious phone numbers. I mean, that's fairly rare. We operate out of a city with fairly low crime, but you'll see these come through every so often. Before we had started recording, you had talked about judging the reservation, not the guest, in response to my question about, would you describe AutoHost as creating a digital fingerprint of who the guest is? And you had a wonderful response. Would you mind sharing me, judging the reservation, not the guest, what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you even use the term kind of, a digital avatar for a
Yes.
person. An avatar is so tied to an individual that we actually make it a point, both from our moral standpoint as well as a real risk kind of perspective, that we want to explain that when AutoHost takes an analysis of a reservation, we take all the various data points about the guest and the booking, but at the end of the day, the risk profile is computed not about a specific guest. So the example I gave quite simply is if Killian was to make a reservation, then Killian booking a 5-day business trip in Chicago might be very different than Killian 4 months down the line booking a 3-bedroom penthouse in Miami for a bachelor party.
Absolutely.
And so even though fraud might not be suspected and it might not be a fake ID, but the types of screening and the risk profile that is required would be different. In both of these cases, also, not to say that you shouldn't host the guest, but we can agree that the risk of the second one is higher, and therefore the security deposit might be higher, the reiterating of rules might be stricter, the guest list you'll be collecting must include all the different guests. So we avoid saying Killian as an individual or John Doe is good or bad or is fraud forever or should be, is risky or not risky, but rather our analysis is on a reservation level and takes all of those parameters into consideration. That's kind of where we really stand behind. We don't judge the person on their own, but only the person as part of the reservation.
It goes back to risk mitigation because at the end of the day, that host could accept a reservation that's been flagged, and they could even decline a reservation that's passed all the screening because their gut or their intuition picks up on something else as well. So at the end of the day,
Exactly.
can you talk about, I've heard, these are very loose numbers, so forgive me, but essentially, like, of all the guests that really cause trouble out of, we owe several thousand guests a month, but there's only a very small portion of those guests that are actually going to cause trouble, or I think the statistic was actually going to result in a guest damage claim. I'm assuming you guys are collecting a lot of information on reservations. Are you starting to see specific groups of people, or specific groups of reservations that seem to be flagged a little bit higher than other groups of reservations? I know you used the example of Killian on a bachelor party in Miami versus a business trip. What are some of the other data points that might be being looked at that send up red flags?
So you have very simple basic parameters that people that even screen with gut feeling at the beginning use. You have your usual culprits. You have your one-nighters and your weekends and your last minutes and your locals, right? Like those are the top four. But whenever I mention those, it always ends with a big but. And the point is you shouldn't not host them. You should just do your screening more thorough. Because if you were just to kind of say, you know what, I'm going to be better safe than sorry, no locals. I mean, will you avoid more parties than the person that does do locals? Theoretically,
Sure.
yes. Will you be leaving money on the table and doing the best thing, not the best thing for your business? Also, yes. So, what we're aiming to do is actually help you maximize your revenue and fine tune who it is you're hosting, right? And so, in terms of problematic reservations, we almost make this like divide separation. You have your usual red flags that are just worth looking into versus red flags that you should decline a reservation. So a credit card that was reported stolen and therefore the security deposit didn't go through, you should decline the booking, right? A name mismatch on the ID and the reservation, and then the guest not answering, and so it's not an innocent name mismatch, but something got flagged as suspicious, and you can't get hold of the guest, and something seems sketchy, and they're using a burner phone number, you should cancel the reservation. Although a last minute booking by a local on a weekend for a one night, the best example I use is, my parents, they live out of town and they're downtown for the
Absolutely.
opera, and they had one glass too many and they just want to stay the night. And by all means, take their money. And so only looking at the red flags without proper screening almost defeats the purpose. And I'll also say that when you get into the unfortunate, more serious levels of fraud, which is not only true for big enterprise, it's true for small and medium players as well. Those will actually are a little bit more sophisticated, and they won't be doing one night local on a weekend. They will be using stolen credit cards and booking a 9-day stay and say that it's a couple coming from Sweden to visit their daughter in university. And your team of agents that is trained to provide incredible customer experience and guest services are not going to spot the lie because they're not trained to. So that is really where those objective data points come into
That's
play.
that's
The one thing I did want
oh,
to,
that's a great
sorry, I was
distinction.
going to
Go
mention,
ahead.
you mentioned the manual stuff. I think it's important to say that you're absolutely right. So what Autohost does and all this, incredible tech that I'm bringing up, at the end of the day, Autohost will never decline a reservation for you. It also won't replace a human. So what Autohost does, especially as you scale, so automation comes as an important factor here. Autohost helps you take care of the objective, mundane, repetitive items so that then a human can come in and say, these 85% are verified. They completed everything. We did our due diligence. The information is on file. They're good to go. I didn't have to do a back and forth. I didn't have to wait for a long time. Didn't have to cause friction for the guest. The tool did that for me. A human can verify them. Versus these 15% say got flagged for review. And out of those 15%, I'm going to have a human have a look at it. Something might be a little bit higher risk than usual. I might contact the guest. I might arrange an in-person check-in. It might be an honest flag, like a name mismatch, and turns out that it's a husband booking for a
Yeah.
wife. A human is going to review them, give their stamp of approval, approve their reservation, and that's it. And then the remaining percent that really did raise a flag that makes you uncomfortable hosting that guest will let you fine tune the reservations that you might not want to proceed with.
You're essentially putting reservations in buckets. Hey, a good portion of our guests, in my notes here, one thing I have is process. You got to screen guests in some way, and you should create a process for that. Obviously, AutoHost offers a process for that, but some people are still doing it their own way. And so something, yeah.
And that's okay too. A
Yeah,
process is better
exactly.
than no
That's what I have
process.
down. Basically, like have something in place. Like at least have a process you're using to screen your
Exactly.
guests. But in doing so, especially it's this game of tug of war between basically providing an amazing guest experience and helping them stay in your home, versus objectively and honestly screening them. So it's almost like you're taking all these reservations and you're putting them in different buckets. And really, the bucket we're trying to minimize is almost your professional scammers or fraudsters, the ones that are jumping through the hoops for the credit card fraud, who have a pretty legitimate background story, and probably are going to tug on the heartstrings of whomever is screening that reservation because they want to help that guest out. So minimizing that bucket of essentially professional fraudsters. How is this different than, did you have something you want to add there? Because that was a little long-winded, sorry.
I did. I'd say that there's two groups. So this one, the one, minimizing professional fraudsters is significant. And I'll say that your typical agent is not
Yes.
trained to be a human lie detector. So yes, that's what we're there for. The second group, which is also very important, and it's a little bit larger in size, is that we're also there to minimize the gray area of risk, the parties, the noise, the vandalism, the compliance. So it might not be professional fraudsters, but that type of a risk is a lot more common for an operator of any size. And the way that it's minimized is twofold. So you either have guests that start going through the screening process, they have to start submitting information, agreeing to rules, adding their guests, and they just come in and say, you know what? I'm sorry, that's not for me. I mean, can I just please cancel at no charge? And you'll say, absolutely, go right ahead. If this is not the right place for your intentions, please go ahead and cancel. So that's step one. They see your rules, like the professional screening process vets them out right away. The second part that is handled is actual just de-escalation. So you're going to de-risk reservations in the way that, let's still pick on you and your friends at a bachelor party. Even if you proceed and the host accepts you, you having gone through a screening process, having explicitly agreed to rules, signed a usage agreement, your friends list is on file, your ID is there, your selfie is there, you have a security deposit on file. If it's a 3-bedroom penthouse, that deposit might be $500 or $1,000. You have something on the line and you're liable for your stay, and you will end up being a better guest. So sometimes it's not a matter of do we host or not host. Sometimes it also comes, or oftentimes I will say, it also comes down to the guests are now, they have their kind of responsibility on the line, and you end up de-risking reservations just by definition.
Okay, that's wonderful. That's de-risking reservations. So this kind of ties into where technology is going in the short-term rental industry. And there's a little bit of opinion, but it seems like there's this tension between losing the human hosting aspect and being replaced by this rapid change in technology and introduction of new technology in the short-term rental market. But in this, it's seemingly in this particular section especially, is you can never lose the human hosting element, or else you're leaving the door open for a lot of errors. So let me be more concise with this. Do you think we'll ever reach a point in guest screening where you could fully eliminate the human being, or do you think that's an essential aspect of completely vetting a guest for a property? There's no right answer. Do you think that's the direction it's heading?
So I think that it's really a matter of host comfort level. I will tell you that the larger the user, so let's say our clients that are running large enterprises, thousands of properties, they actually aim to have automation be a very big part of the process. So we set very, very concrete and thorough business rules. Everything gets put into those buckets you talk about. In different types of situations, we go through all these if-then scenarios to kind of minimize at the end of the day who requires manual review. Theoretically, if we're going to put together an algorithm, you could say that, you know what, if I'm going to fine-tune it so much, at the end of the day, I don't want to waste people on this at all. If somebody gets flagged for review, by my calculation, that ends up being 2.7%, you know what? I'm just going to decline them to be better safe than sorry. So theoretically, you achieved your automation there. Do I think that's the smart thing to do? Not necessarily, because I think that there is an element of judgment calls and kind of risk tolerance that an operator might want to have in place. So I don't think we're moving towards pure automation of things, but you're right that this element of, where do we lose the personal touch? Where you have objective activities, repetitive, mundane tasks, and even ones that are prone to human error, like guest screening, is not where you're providing the guest experience. So if you actually present a very professional form, so you've seen the Autohost guest portal, if your guest goes through a very nicely branded and professional set of collecting information, and you compare that to asking them a bunch of questions on Airbnb back and forth, and then asking them to send the ID by email, and then the ID was blurry, so please resend it, and then give me a call and I'll write down your credit card number, and then when you come in, I'm going to do something else, which is a very manual process. That's not good human manual,
No.
right? That's not where you're adding value to the guest experience. So if we can automate those types of things and have your team focus on guest experience value. If they put in their Autohost form that they're there for an anniversary, by all means, set a notification, get your Slack pinging, and if they're there for an anniversary, leave them a bottle of wine. You just won all around,
Absolutely.
right? If there's any unique needs or like any specific questions, I think being responsive to a question like, hey, are the pillows down or synthetic? Or where is the nearest subway station? Or can I check in an hour early? If you were very quick to respond to those, and the mundane processes were automated, I think you'd be winning on all fronts.
That's a great answer. The balance of screening versus privacy. How do you effectively screen a guest or screen a reservation without infringing on guest privacy? And that also ties into, what's the difference between hotels screening reservation versus maybe what the short-term rental industry is doing to screen a guest. So kind of two questions in one, but yeah.
Twofold. So let's start with the fact that short-term rental is a lot less standardized. So I mean, you could have situations where people use their judgment and how they want to screen and what information to collect, and we can't guarantee that privacy is always maintained. In the case of, say, proper process, when it comes to privacy, the point isn't that there's things you can't ask. Although, I mean, you have things like, their sexual orientation is not important to screening and the color of their skin is not relevant to screening. But when it comes to privacy of collecting their ID or keeping their phone number even or personal information on a file, that is really where either tools like Autohost or whatever system it is you're using, but the fact that you as a professional and legitimate operator are using this information only for the intended purposes of validating the identity, making sure the guest is good to stay, having enough information if you need. So sometimes you might need that for authority reporting, for HOA, for building registration, for whatever it is you need. It's your responsibility to be using whichever tools are at your disposal to make sure that the information is saved securely, that any sensitive data like criminal background checks or credit cards are properly encrypted and not, written on pieces of paper or in an Excel file. And so guest data can definitely be stored. Are you allowed to that data? I mean, as they're renting out your property, they choose to give you that information, and it's a pretty common practice in hospitality that you hold some personal information. You need to know who's walking through the door, right? You're not selling them a pair of shoes. You're giving them keys to a place to use at their disposal and then give back. So there's an element of anonymity that we want to make sure we remove from the equation.
Okay, and then the second part of that, how does that differ a little bit from how a hotel may be screening their guests? Or is it a very similar process?
So I'll say that short-term rental operators use a lot more softer data
Okay.
points. So for example, you would ask something like, what is, the intention of your visit? And theoretically, if they selected party, you could flag them for review. When it comes to a hotel, because they work in bulk and because they have their operations centralized and because they have a lot more staff on hand, hotels are a lot more, I would say, like pragmatic and systematic with their screening. So hotels would go less into the softer data points and they would be like, we need an ID on file, it needs to be valid, it needs to match their selfie, we need a credit card on file with a high enough security deposit, the name needs to match across the board. So they're gonna go only with the objective data points. I mean, make sure that the person is who they say they are and that they agree to the rules. Hotels will not go deeper into judging. They said they're not going to party, but we think they're going to party. Also, keep in mind, hotel, just by default of infrastructure, there's staff on file. So you're less likely to have a 50-person party in a hotel room because hotel staff will stop it. So when it comes to hotels that are using Autohost, it's less so to stop parties and it's mostly for process improvement and kind of operational efficiency, automation, collection of information. So hotels need to know who's inside. So the actual collection of data, be it for authority reporting purposes, which differs geographically. So Europe needs to report whoever stays in your property. That is really where hotels use guest vetting and the guest registration process, whereas STRs might be more concerned with that gray area of problems, you know, risk, vandalism, smoking, rule compliance kind of
So
things.
it seems in some respects, at least Autohost and the software that Autohost provides for at least just the short-term rental market specifically, is in some ways surpassed or is it just has to be considered of a lot more, a lot more events that could pop up. It seems to be a little bit more broader than just the very objective screening process of hotels.
So that's the beauty of it. You can be in control of where your risk tolerance lies, right?
Absolutely.
You asked me earlier about,
No,
sorry?
absolutely.
You asked me earlier about where do we draw the line in, human involvement. That's an example of where that would be. So some people could say that, you know what, I'm really uncomfortable with any gathering. So you can't have outside guests come in. No, I'm not okay with a dinner party. Some people could say, I mean, by all means, go ahead and have a thing. You can smoke on the balcony. I'm gonna hook you up with whatever you need for it. Enjoy your stay. Just don't break anything. Other properties will say, you know what? I mean, pay a damage deposit. Like, do whatever it is with your stay. So you need to really set where your tolerance is, what it is you're willing to accept, and how that affects your revenue. At the end of the day, you have revenues and expenses. If people having a gathering and the result is a few broken glasses, that's $20, and so that might be worth the $2,000 you made for the booking.
You know,
I'm not encouraging
yeah.
parties, but that's really where your
Absolutely,
tolerance is.
and you made a good point. The potential for a size of party in hotel is different than size and potential for party in a residential vacation rental. It's not necessarily apples to oranges, but I believe there's a lot of people out there, especially people who are relatively new to the short-term rental industry, that are completely. I speak to a lot of them on a daily basis, being on owner acquisition side of things, but that are they believe really the only process of screening a guest aside from conversation is looking at their 5-star review system. What are your thoughts on that system? I'm of the opinion that it is just way too subjective to even really be considered a significantly valuable data point for screening a guest. Could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah. Um, it's a tiny little bit better than
Sure.
nothing, and then again can be very misleading. So I mean, of course, you can have fake reviews and you can have misleading reviews, but and that is also why, by the way, so from our perspective, that we keep talking objective data points, we don't actually take Airbnb reviews into consideration. Many of our users are on multiple OTAs, so because our point is to even out the playing field, reviews can be really misleading. So I mean, the number of reviews doesn't necessarily guarantee whether it's good or bad. When you have a small operation and your team is able to read through the 15 reviews that a guest has, I mean, a review is not always, it's not Boolean, right? You'd have to read through something, and then you have a gray area of opinion. So you'll have one host that will say, you know what, these guys were really disrespectful. It said no shoes in the house, and they wore their shoes. And when they left, there were a bunch of takeout containers everywhere. Whereas you'll have somebody else that's running a professional operation who'll say, I mean, takeout containers are fine. They paid for a cleaning fee. Sure, they could have been nicer and clean up after themselves, but that's not cause for concern. Like they didn't have a meth lab explode. They're good.
Yeah.
So you have subjectiveness, and then you also have the fallacy of zero reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Zero reviews is risky. So do we judge a guest for not having reviews, or do we subconsciously assume, well, no review also means no bad review? And then you get into, okay, so no bad review, that is where you open the door to possible somebody could have had bad reviews and now their friend is booking, right?
Absolutely.
Through another profile, or they opened a new profile. So I think that I won't say reviews are wrong. I will just say that relying on reviews is misleading. When you see in front of you a lot of positive reviews, are they all likely to be fake? I'm gonna say I would also look at them like
Sure.
psychologically when you're analyzing something, or let's say the objective check flagged somebody for review. By all means, if there's also some reviews from other hosts, read them. And similarly, if you're seeing negative reviews, by all means read those and see. Some reviews are very consistent, like these guys were really messy and they refused to leave on time, and the place was left horrible and they stole a bunch of sheets. Versus another type of a bad review that you can use your judgment call and say, am I comfortable hosting this guest or not? So I'm going to say that for personal considerations, reading them might offer some value, but I'm always hesitant to like make sure that value is not even a misleading
Gotcha.
one.
You know, you brought up something that is just interesting to me, and that's kind of psychological biases or psychological pitfalls in thinking. What are some other cognitive biases you think that people experience when they're screening guests, like the zero review fallacy? Any other ones that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, a longer stay by default is safer, right? Theoretically.
That's the old, a
Older
lot of people
people.
move from long-term rentals to short-term rentals, so they're used to signing one-year leases and they go to under 29 days stays, and that's a huge one. I'm actually glad you brought that up. My year-long tenants, it's one person. I've spoken to them, and they're there for a while, so there's comfort there as opposed to under 29 days.
Fair enough. And you're right. When I say short stay, I mean 1 to 3 days. And when I say long stay, I mean,
Oh,
five
I
plus
see.
to a
Okay,
couple of
very
weeks.
interesting. So the fallacy that maybe my 2 week reservation is more safe and secure than my 1 to 2.
One
Okay.
night.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Yeah, exactly. And good thing you brought that up because when I say long, I'm within the STR space so much that for
Exactly.
me, long term is never yearly leases. So,
Well, so then
sorry, you're going to say something?
we've kind of have a in between type of management that we more midterm corporate rentals we refer to them. But this would be your 30 plus day stays, but more, around your 90-day max stays, maybe your 4 or 5 month stays, but they're furnished rentals, and the majority of the rentals are 30 to 60, maybe to 90 days. Your traveling nurses, etc. Just could you give your brief thoughts on screening for those types of guests? Is that would you say that AutoHost software still applies for that type of area? We're stepping into a little bit of real estate rules, but just general thoughts, I suppose, on maybe your 30-day
So
plus.
I think absolutely. Let's call those medium
Okay,
term stays, and I think that for those ones, again. So you're now less concerned about a local gang or even not gang group of friends booking a place for a party. But when you're talking about medium term stays, that is where it might be less of a of a fraud risk. I'll also say that fraud is very unlikely to book for months at a time because at the end of the day, credit cards get reported stolen and issues do come up. So fraud might not book for one night and again, when I say fraud, I mean criminal
yes.
activity behind fraud, be it drug smuggling in the unit or gang activity or weapons or escort services or anything sketchy that could be going on behind closed doors are less likely to rent a place for a very prolonged period. But when it comes to a couple of months of a stay, your biggest focus is just really validating the guest identity. And the same de risking that I talked about for the short term stay is still valid because somebody that's renting a place for 2 to 3 months are gonna, they become a local. They could, I mean, you can't say no outside guests. They live there, it's their place. So they might have friends over. But the difference between are they gonna have two friends over or 25 friends over, that constitutes a difference. Are they going to maintain your property or not? When you come to longer term stays, again, you're also touching on the types of damages, right? So when it comes to a party, you might be scared that the TV is going to smash. When it comes to a longer term stay, it's the overall wear and tear and maintenance of the place and how careful they are and how respectful they are of their place. And even in those situations, having their information on file, signing those leases and usage agreements, having a security deposit, making sure that they are in charge of their damages and incidentals does let you de escalate any possible risk that the reservation could come up with, and therefore a guest is likely to be a better behaved guest.
Okay, wonderful. What are your thoughts on the future of guest screening, the future of reservation screening? Where do you see AutoHost going? Do you guys have any major projects that you can talk about that you see in the foreseeable future?
It's a fun
Yeah,
question.
or just
So,
personal
so,
interest.
so
Yeah,
most
that
of our
you'd like to see the industry go.
that's a separate question.
Yeah.
I'll try to
Okay.
answer both. So in terms of AutoHost, we do have a lot of fun projects that are going on, mostly integration. So what we want to see is we recognize that AutoHost is a player in an ecosystem. And so we're working with a lot of partners there's so many tech companies and tools out in the space right now that for an operator, be it a tech savvy one or a small one or a big one, you want to see the various vendors playing together. So right now, things like we're partnered with Operato, and so we have a beautiful situation where as soon as the guest is verified, that is where the door lock will be released. Or let's say you have noise sensors in your units, and so your noise aware can be connected, and you can see the noise graph on Autohost depending on what the guest profile was, and try to assess whether it requires intervention or not. So in terms of Autohost, we kind of do see the guest vetting process becoming more of a standard, especially with professional operators, right? Airbnb really pushes for the fact that their reviews are sufficient, and Airbnb will continue trying to ensure as much trust and safety on their platform as possible. But once operators become more professional, they go on various platforms, that is where really you need to even out the playing field. So in terms of Autohost, I just want to see this type of guest vetting and just the concept of knowing your guest, right? The KYC, know your customer concept is very, very common. It's a basic methodology in the finance world, in real estate, in lending. And so there's no reason that hospitality is behind. And in that sense, just validating ID, you know who's walking through the door, trust and safety is maintained across the board, is where I would love to see Autohost come in while reducing things like wrong discrimination and unjustified discrimination and prejudice and personal judgment. We want to be bringing technology and those objective data points to be making the decisions for you, as opposed to you training a team of agents to look at a picture and say she looks
Yeah,
sketchy, because that's not
absolutely.
that's not valid.
No. And
Um,
I see the passion. I mean, thank you for what you and what AutoHost does in elevating this short-term rental industry, bringing a level of safety, professionalism, and standard that ultimately increases the guest experience and helps this industry move away from this kind of sense of stranger danger that still hides around on the outskirts of this industry for some people.
right. That's the
Yeah.
goal.
Well, Ela Mezhiborsky, thank you for joining us again. Ela is the co-founder and CPO of Autohost, and we just had an absolute wonderful time speaking with you today. Thank you for joining us, Ela.
Thank you, Hugh. Great having you here.
Thank you.